ghost town, because you know the men won't stay around if the women don't come to settle with them. So that's why we use the title of our program. And thank you for coming on this evening. We appreciate it. I'm going to begin talking about 5 very remarkable women. Unfortunately, we don't have much about their women's contributions in Crete. Many have been, most of our stories, our articles have been about men, because they were the storekeepers, the other people that received more attention. Whereas the women really did all the work at home, as all of you know. But this was the frontier, right here in Crete Township. It was not like what it looks like today. It was the frontier because southern Illinois was settled really before this part. Yes, there were probably, by the early 1830s, there were probably a couple hundred or maybe a few more in Chicago. So those people that came here from New England and New York, they were the initial settlers. They were coming on a great adventure, an adventure of hardship and challenges that I'm sure they never imagined. And one of the primary sources of information was this 1922 booklet put out by the Crete Women's Club. People wrote letters and they tried to get some information on the early settlers of Crete. So this is the first source of information besides the newspapers that Carol Treebold and I have used. And in the very front of that, it talks about Crete as a frontier. And on the first page, it says, deer, grouse, and quail, and many other wild animals made hunting plentiful. But the nights were made weird by the continuous howling of wolves patrolling our cabins. And that's what it was like. There was no one else here when the first ones came. And so I'd like to give you a little bit of background besides telling you that Illinois became a state in 1818, but northern Illinois was not settled because there were so many Indians who had land here. The United States government made a peace treaty with them, and most of them left or were forced to leave and go west of the Mississippi River. Some of them, led by Black Hawk, came back in 1832, and the U.S. military forced and defeated them and put them in chains and took them to the fort and imprisoned them. There were a few Indians left here, as I'll talk about, but most of the Indians had left. So it opened it up for an opportunity by those in other states from the east coming to settle in land here that they thought their family would thrive. Little did they know what was to be happened to them. Most of them made it, and the first lady that I would like to talk about is Dorothy Beebe. And Dorothy Beebe, as you look on that map that I gave you of Crete Township, she and her husband settled in 1835 in the northeastern part of Crete Township. And they settled there because Plum Creek was going through there. There was a nice grove of trees along with land that they thought that they could farm. But the journey was something that they did not expect to happen to them. They left Vermont in 1835. They had 3 little children, and Dorothy Beebe and her husband Menoris had a wagon. They left Vermont, went through New York State along the trails, and when they got to Buffalo, they got on a vessel, sailing vessel, and went to Detroit, got off and bought another wagon, probably not new, horse and harness, and came here along the rutted trails. The rutted trails that a few wagons had been across and that were created originally by the Indians. What happened at some point on the trail was that Menoris Beebe became extremely ill. So ill that he couldn't do anything but lay in the back of the wagon. So who was it that had to take over? And as Dorothy's daughter explained later in a letter to the Women's Club, she said, my mother took over the reins, had one little child on one side of her, another child on the other, and held the baby in her arms with the reins in her other hand to, make the wagon move forward with the horse. She came the rest of the way and down the Vincent's wagon road to the little spot that they thought would be a good place to homestead, make a claim on it, farm it, and then obtain possession of that land. So when they got here, they came with another couple from Vermont, so there were two of them coming. Kyle's also came. And what happened was that as soon as you get there, that there's nothing around. There's no food except for the supplies that they had left over. No firewood ready for them, no cabins ready for them. So the first thing that they had to do was to survive in this land, this desolate land with no other people. No stores, no neighbors or anything to help them out. So we don't know how long it took Menoras to recover, but perhaps some time. And meanwhile, of course, they had to sleep in their wagons until the men could use their axes and saws to saw down enough wood and build a very small log cabin. They endured that. They also had to find food. Now, there was lots of wild animals around here and birds, and that's how they lived, along with collecting berries for their family, until they could put in some crops, which some of our settlers didn't come until fall or late summer. So I don't know how they survived, but they survived. The whole thing was that people survived as long as the husband and wife worked from dawn to dusk for the survival of the family. After 1835, the next year, of course, Dorothy had another baby. The next couple of years, she had another baby. And then, unfortunately, after a couple of years, Mr. Kyle died, being hit by a huge log, and we don't know what happened then to his family. But then, 8 years after they were there, at the age of 39, in 1843, Menoras Beebe died. So here is Dorothy Beebe by herself. A few of the other Beebe families have come to live in this grove area in northeastern Crete Township. She is confronted with at least 5 little children, if not a few more, and wondering what to do. And in fact, many people, including Abraham Lincoln's father, what did he do when his wife died? Found another woman. And so, as far as I know, she didn't find another man. Survival was still primary because she had to take over everything. So, at some point, she left, as some of the other babies did, and went to Kankakee. But just the remarkable life, the unbelievable life with the challenges that we really can't imagine just to survive every day. The next person I'd like to talk about is Diantha Wood. Now, we all know about Willard Wood, but Diantha Wood is just as important as Willard. He was a teacher in Vermont. He even taught his wife, Diantha, as she was one of his students. They decided in 1836 that maybe their life would be better for their family if they headed west. And they had heard that land would be available for those who homesteaded in Illinois. So they moved forward, and in fact, with their wagon and their few belongings, with their first child, a 3-month-old baby girl, and she was nursing, of course. And what they did is they traveled 350 miles along New York State, the roads. When in fact they got to Buffalo, they boarded the boat again, and when they got off at Detroit and went down the ramp, they also had to buy a horse, a harness, and a wagon, and move their few belongings into that. They moved then along the trails, and they were going to go west of Chicago, but they heard it was kind of watery, so they decided to go south. They ended up in a place that had some trees, there was some open area, and that area is the middle of Crete today. So together, they landed there. I'm sure they probably looked at each other and said, "Well, my gosh, there's nothing here." And there was no wood, there was no cabin, there was no outhouse for them. There was no water, no well. There was a little creek, Goose Creek, that had some water around here, but we know Goose Creek dries up half of the year. And so the two of them had to depend upon each other to get the things, to get the food, to do everything necessary for survival. They ended up here in June of 1836 in time to probably put a few crops in. Maybe they met the Beebes in Beebe Grove area, and there was one family in the northwestern part of Crete Township, which was the Starr family, in an area called Thor Grove, the very northwestern part. And maybe Willard was able to get some help in with the trees, but he used his horse and wagon to pull the lumber in there to eventually build a cabin. And so I want to admit to all of you that I have changed my mind about something in history that I've written about. I feel I have made a grave error, and instead of Willard Wood being the sole founder of Crete, don't you think it's fair that we should acknowledge Diantha as a co-founder, who are right here together, who have went through the same hardships, and I'm sure if in fact she was a strong lady, which she had to be, she had 10 more children, gave birth to 10 more children after they arrived. No doctor came here to Crete until 1848. Hopefully Willard helped her at the end, because he helped her in the beginning of the conception part of Brittany's child. And so I think it's only right that we should say that Crete had two founders, Willard and Diantha Wood. Or, if you want to say it, since she's first in this picture, Diantha and Willard Wood together were the co-founders of Crete. It's not to take away from Willard Wood and all that he did. He was the first teacher here in Crete. He became Justice of the Peace. He became an attorney. He eventually became a commissioner on the Will County Board, and he did a lot of things for Crete. He was a shoemaker too, a man of all trades. They set up the first inn for people to stay in here in Crete. But who did all the work at home? Who did all the chores? Who had to bring the buckets of water into the house every day? Who had to sew the clothes, repair the clothes for the hand-me-downs to all the kids? Who had to feed the kids and do all that work? It was really a partnership between husband and wife. And interesting enough, I thought that just men owned land. But when I looked at the deeds for the land that was donated to the Crete Methodist Church here in Crete and the Crete Congregational Church, Willard and Diantha were on those deeds as owners of the property. So justice is in favor, as we're learning, and I'm acknowledging it today to all of you. So from that, of course, Crete grew, and it was Willard Wood that gave Crete its name, looking through the Bible. The next person I would like to talk about is Lucy Hughes. This is a terrible picture of her, but this is in one of our Crete Remembered books. Lucy Hughes and Lumen Hughes came from Vermont also. They started out in 1835, but theirs was a 2-year Well, first of all, they already had 10 kids in Vermont. 9 of the 10 kids came with them. The oldest one stayed there in Vermont. And they packed their few necessities up. And then they came to Troy, New York. And they got on a small boat that went along the Erie Canal. I'm sure in your history you learned about the Erie Canal. I grew up in New York State, so I knew all about the Erie Canal. But my mother lived along the Erie Canal. It was as wide as about this room, and that's it. So the people, when they piled their possessions onto this boat, that they then sat on top of their possessions, slept there, rode there during the day, or they could walk behind the mule that was pulling the boat on the dirt trail along the Erie Canal. When they got to Buffalo, New York, they did the usual things. They got on another boat to go across Lake Erie to Detroit. And when they got off the boat, they again had to buy a wagon, fit their kids, their 9 kids, into it. And along this time now, Lucy, the brave woman that she was, she had a physical condition. Can any of you guess what that physical condition that she had along this whole trip? Pardon?
Arthritis?
No.
Was she pregnant?
Yes, she was pregnant with her 11th child. So unfortunately, by the time they got to an area near Blue Island, it was a very frigid November at that time. And so they found in the area of Blue Island an unfinished cabin, and they and their 9 children went into this unfinished cabin out in the woods, somehow survived that winter, and in the winter months she gave birth to the 11th child, and that 11th child survived. So the next spring they found some other land that they thought that they could homestead around Blue Island, and they were there from the winter 1836 to 1837. And then Lumen and Lucy decided that land was not good enough. So they said, I think we'll start heading south again. They did end up in Crete Township then, not too far away, where Balmoral Racetrack is now located. That was the family farm. Now in that year, then, so they arrived in 1837, and in 1837, what other physical condition did she have again? Yes. So in 1837, she gave birth to her 12th child and last child. In 1838, her eldest daughter married, and in 1839, her eldest daughter died of childbirth. But they had so many children, and they put in claims for homestead, and so did their children, that it was a whole group of Hughes, H-E-W-E-S, that settled around there, put claims in, homesteaded, farmed the land, and so it became known as Hughesburg. So, you know, especially with all those children and mouths to feed and everything, I just have to give her a lot of credit. But on top of that, a couple of years after that, Lumen's father decided to join them. Now, he was quite elderly because he fought in the American Revolution. He made the trip with someone else along the whole journey, came and lived with them too, in the small initial cabin. So here in Crete, Illinois, Crete was not founded until 1836, at least that's the village, and then the first settlements in 1834 and 35. But we do have William Hughes, an American Revolutionary soldier, buried in the Crete Cemetery. So it was a large family. The next person is Eleanor Hood. Eleanor Hood is an interesting person. This is a picture of her when she was elderly in Crete. It's in one of our Crete Remembered books. This is a picture of her and her husband, Dr. Samuel Hood, when they were elderly, too. And I have another picture I'll show you in a minute of the house that they built. But they're an interesting couple, and especially Eleanor. Eleanor was born through medical school. You study medicine through with a pharmacist. And they married. And then they, after living in Philadelphia for a few years, or in Pennsylvania, they moved to Missouri. From Missouri, they were there for a couple of years, and then in 1848, they moved here to Crete. We don't know why. Maybe they knew someone here in Crete. But as they moved here, her daughter wrote another letter about their adventures here in Crete, or coming to Crete. And their daughter Maria Hood wrote that Dr. Hood, after practicing medicine for 4 years in Missouri, came to Illinois by wagon. Mrs. Hood rode horseback most of the way with one child in front of her and one child behind her. Dr. Hood got to ride in the wagon. And when they arrived in what is now Crete Township, then Thorn Grove, up in the northwest corner, they were hospitably invited to sojourn, what a nice old word, sojourn several weeks in the log house of Mr. and Mrs. Starr. They were the first settlers in Thorn Grove. Dr. and Mrs. Hood then moved into a cabin which had no floor. And Mrs. Hood was so happy when finally the doctor secured some boards and laid them on the ground in one end of the cabin for the beds to stand on. She often said that in her early days it was no uncommon custom for the ladies to have their pipes and snuff boxes. That's something new to us, but I guess they had a lot to cope with. After coming to Crete, Dr. Hood practiced medicine for a number of years, then turning his attention to farming. He made most of his sick calls via horseback with his pill satchel fastened to his saddle, and went around to the various homes for people who needed him. So once they arrived here, and once they had the cabin, in which finally they got some boards under their beds, she had a total of 9 children. Hopefully, well, her husband was a doctor, so he helped at the birth end. But she also had to do so much just to maintain their family for survival. At that point in 1848, again, very few people were here in the village of Crete. God bless you. Finally, in 1872, they built a new home for themselves on South Main Street. It is a home that the 6th generation of that family still lives in. The descendants are Ed and Harriet Gensler. Harriet is the 6th generation, as is her sister Sabra Fetty, lives in Crete. The house has been added on to by several different family members over the years, but it's been passed down from one generation to the next, which is so nice to hear. So now, let me just show you this home, the picture of the home. This is home with a couple family members, a prized horse that they have, Dr. Hood had, and the family. Mrs. Hood is sitting over here at this one, but it's still home. Home looks very much like it used to look. And it's a beautiful home. Ed and Harriet have done so much to maintain it, and inside is gorgeous. Now the next lady, remarkable lady I'd like to talk about is Martha Gaines. And you've heard the Gaines family. And so they have been here for a number of generations too. And as a result, the Gaines family and Bob Gaines is still farming the land. But Martha Gaines, right here is a picture, you can see her closely. Her family were the Adams family, and the Catherine and Horace Adams came to Thorn Grove area in 1845, but Horace had been here in the 1830s. She was the youngest daughter of the Adams, and the stories that have been passed down from one generation to the next are very interesting. They're in a whole story in our Crete Remembered books. And so, but one of them was that she saw an Indian through one of the windows in their small cabin, and she started screaming, and she said, "Mommy, Daddy, you know, cover that window," because seeing an Indian, there were still some Indians here back in the 1840s, here and there, and so then they also, the Indian was just different. I guess it was the first time as a little girl she had seen one. They were fairly friendly, and they didn't disturb people at all. In 1872, she married Horatio Gaines, and they built a home and barns up on North Main Street. And North Main Street is where Dr. Piscopo, it's the same home, has his chiropractic office. And what happened was that her husband, Horatio, was quite a horse knowledge person, almost a horse whisperer. And in 1888, they had two sons, one who was 8 and one who was 15. And he heard something in the barn, and there were horse thieves in the barn. And he tried to fight them, get rid of them, but they had some wooden things, bats and other things, and they really hit him so many times that eventually he died from those wounds. So here's another widow confronted with what to do. Her older son, Phyllis Gaines, age 15, wanted to go on to college. He gave up that dream, and he and his mother worked the farm. And then he put his younger brother through the University of Illinois himself when he wanted to go. Phyllis Gaines, there are many stories about Phyllis Gaines too, but some of the farmland right there on North Main Street was sold, as the house was, but they are still farming, the 6th generation, their farmland. And we're so lucky to have farmland in the village of Crete in this day and age. There's another family, Lucille Kester's family, from her husband, that would date back to the 1840s, right? 1840s. Yes, 47. And they came here, and now her husband, George, was the 5th generation or 6th generation. But there we have another whole family thing in the Crete Remembered books, and that house, she lives 2 houses away in the red house, and that is her grandchildren and even maybe a few great-grandchildren have enjoyed being there at the house with Lucille. So we are so fortunate, really, to have a number of people still living here and taking care of their homes and descendants. So now I'd like to conclude my part of this program and say a couple things. One is, let's acknowledge that survival depended on husbands and wives working together. It was impossible coming here. We were the frontier. We were the wilderness area. It was like if you were in one of our national parks, completely alone in the middle of the national park with nothing but a few possessions at all, trying to survive and raising children. The other thing is, Carol Trebold and I, our books are still available. You can read them here in the library. We have them. The library has them for sale. And please remember that we had 2 co-founders of Crete, along with many other very remarkable women. And now, the better part of our program, it's my honor to introduce Ida Adams. Ida Adams, before she speaks, did so much in Crete, but I know that she won't tell you about this. But in the early 1990s or late 1980s, she was recognized by the village of Crete for her contributions to Crete, and she became the Grand Parade Marshal of one of our Memorial Day parades. So, but here is Ida Adams to tell you about her life herself. So Ida, come on up front.
what it was like when I was growing up from birth to 1912. And I hope you have your little sheets in front of you that'll help you as I go along with this talk. I can't talk about me without talking about my family that came before me. Back in the 1840s in the Austrian Empire, which Germany was a part of back then, they had an emperor who was he was a terrible emperor. All he cared about was his military and the aristocracy. He forced all the young men to go into the military. If you didn't do it, you went to jail or you got beat up. He took land from anybody he wanted to. And this upset everybody, especially in Sabenhausen, which is where my Clement family started. So there was a revolt, and you know what happens after a revolt, especially when the emperor won. Now he levied taxes on everybody. More young men were told they had to go into the military. And my great-grandfather, and you can see where his in is, was Johann Christian Clement, and his wife was Elizabeth. He was a prosperous businessman. You can see a picture of his inn here at restaurant in Saberhausen. Many of the Germans left the area to get out and away from the emperor, and they came to America. Some settled here in Illinois, and they wrote letters back to my great-grandfather and said, you should come to Illinois. Cheap land, wonderful land to grow crops, and all the wonderful freedoms you have here. So my great-grandfather Johann sold his restaurant and inn, and in your pamphlet there is a picture of it today, and it's still being run by relatives. You get a picture of that? I know it says it's not spelled right, Saberhausen, but that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, he packed up his family, all his possessions, and he moved to America and started farming in Illinois. He had 5 children, and one of those was my Grandpa Henry. Grandpa Henry was raised as a farmer, so he wanted to farm too, and he bought some land in Crete. He had 13 children with his wife, Catherine. Take a look on page 2, and you'll see a picture of all those children, some of their wives and their children. It was a huge amount of people. And if you ever wondered why Clemmy Road is called Clemmy Road, it's because they had farms up and down the border of that road. Now, of those 13 children my Grandpa Henry had, my father was one of them. And there's a wonderful picture right below of my father, Colonel John Charles Clemmy, and my mother, Ella Sarah Corwin Clemmy. Now, what was my dad like? He was fun-loving. He loved to talk to people. He loved to travel. He was a prankster. He had a great sense of humor. Kind of like me. And if you look at my mother, she was the total opposite, raised as a proper Victorian lady. Look at her face. Very severe. And she was a disciplinarian of the house. I guess opposites do attract. Now, she was an excellent seamstress. And when she found herself alone in the world, she had to find a way to survive. And what she chose to do was be a seamstress and go to a farm and get free room and board, and then they would pay a fee, and she'd sew clothes for everybody in the farm. Then she'd move on to the next farm when she had outfitted everybody, and so on and so on. The last farm she came to work was my Grandpa Clemmy's, and there she met my father, and they fell in love, and they got married. Now, they got married, moved to Crete, and if you look at the picture of me, I was born April 26, 1891, at 1370 Wood Street. The house is still there. It's right across from Town Hall. My parents had 5 children. My older brother Alfred died at birth, and many children did die young in those days. They said if your child was healthy by the age of 10, that they would probably make it into adulthood. I was the second born. Then I had 2 sisters, Catherine, who married Arnold Hartman, and later Henry Tachi. I hope you recognize some of these names. And my sister Edna married Augustus, but we call him Gus Janetsky. And then my wonderful brother Walter married Helen Erickson. Now, what was my mother like? She was a Victorian lady, brought up in a time where everybody had a good posture and were very strict. Victorian ladies grew up during the time of Queen Victoria. I grew up in the time of King Edward, Victoria's son, and that's why I'm called an Edwardian lady. But still, she kept her Victorian ideas. Now, I was fun-loving. I like to do different things. I like to read. I like to ride my horse. I like to play games. I was very competitive and certainly a tomboy. But the thing I liked to do the best was irritate my two younger sisters. I was always the first one up in the morning. And I would get up and I'd make a noise and I'd yell, "Shoe button wars!" And everybody get out of bed and sleepily go get their shoes. And then we would have this. We would have competitive races, of which I always won. The second thing I did to irritate them was I would hide under their bed. I would make a noise in the morning. They'd jump out of their beds and I'd grab their ankles when their feet hit the floor and they'd scream bloody murder and wake up the whole house. Did I get in trouble for that? You can bet I did. Did I stop? No, I did not. I just got smart and I'd wait till they thought that I wasn't going to do it, and then I'd do it again. Now, again, if you look at the Clemmies there, my father was raised a farmer, so he started farming near Bemis Road. I loved living on the farm because I didn't have all the strict rules I had in town. I could let my hair fly, I could go barefoot, I could play with the animals, I could swim in the swimming hole. All these things that when I got to town, my mother frowned upon and thought them very improper for a young lady. But after a few years, my father decided he did not want to be a farmer anymore. He wanted to be an auctioneer. So he did all the paperwork he had to do, registered, got his certificate, and when he got it, that's when he got the title of colonel. And he loved being an auctioneer. He auctioned both in English and in German. And he was the only auctioneer at that time who was certified to call sales both in Indiana and Illinois. And one day, to show you how devoted he was auctioning off some cattle at a farm, and the cattle got too close to him and kicked him and broke him 2 places on his leg. Did he stop? No. He went through the whole auction, and then he collapsed and had to be taken to the doctor. That's it. Okay, let's turn to the next page. Life as a young woman. You saw my picture on the first page. And again, my mother was raised a Victorian. So at 16, I put my hair up, my skirts went down, I learned to wear a corset, I learned to clean the house, play the piano, do all the things a proper Edwardian girl should do. But most of all, I learned the Victoria mantra. Find a man who can provide for you. Marry him. Be a Christian wife and an excellent housekeeper and provide children. That was drilled into me for years, and I'm sure my mother thought I wasn't a very good student. Now, part of the Victorian age was reuse, repurpose. So my mother would have a dress. When she got tired of wearing it, it would be cut down and I'd wear it, and then it'd go down to Catherine and down to Edna until finally it'd end up in the rag bag, and we used it for rugs or whatever else that we needed. My mother had a lavender dress right here. And I loved that lavender dress, and I wanted to wear that. And I kept pestering her. "Oh, Mom, when will I get to wear that dress?" And she said, "I'll let you know when I'm tired of it." Well, I watched that dress for a solid year, and it was in her closet way in the back on a peg. So when she went to visit relatives on a weekend, I got the dress out. I cut it down. I tucked it in, and I looked really good. And I thought my mother would love that I was so good at being a seamstress. Well, she came home on Sunday, and she no sooner put her foot in that front door, my 2 sisters ratted on me right away. And she was fierce. I don't think I've ever seen my mother that angry. She was all ready to rip that dress up and burn it, but that Victorian mentality went through her head, and she said, "I'm not going to destroy a purple dress." So I was punished. And I knew I did the wrong thing. I had to scrub the wood floors for a month. I had to take the slops out to the outhouse for a month. And I had to weed the garden all by myself for a month. My sisters loved this. Now, you notice I like pretty things and I like dresses, and I wanted some extra money so that I could buy some pretty things. Now, job opportunities weren't too good for women in Crete at that time. You could be a midwife, you could be a teacher, you could be a clerk or a typist, and of course, most girls were in domestic service, like my dear Evelyn here. Girls from the farm would come to the town, and they would be paid a fee for their work, and 95% of that money went to their parents to pay their bills. But I wanted to find a good job. All of a sudden, one day, I heard there was a new company opening up in Crete, a telephone company. Have you ever heard of such a thing? I got myself down there, and I applied, and I got the job. What were the rules? You must be modestly attired. You must speak slowly and clearly. You must be very polite. And whatever you hear in this room stays in this room. Because everybody in Crete who called through us, we heard what was going on. I knew everybody's business. It was a great job. So I became, at 16, one of Crete's hello girls. Now, 16, I dated a little bit, but I wasn't too excited about it because I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world. I wanted a really great job. So I didn't think much of any of the guys around Crete at that time anyway. Now, if you should be on page, what page are you looking at? Hard to turn things away. If you look at the top page, this was in my scrapbook, and underneath it I wrote, "This is where I first met Les." And if you look at the telephone pole, right next to that pole was where I first saw him. Oh, I'm telling you, ladies, it was love at first sight. All thoughts of traveling and jobs and everything else went right out the window. And I looked at him, and I don't mind telling you, I set my cap for that. Take a look at him. He was gorgeous. Anyway, his name was Leslie Byron Adams, and he was the son of a prominent Crete family. And if you look over to the right, you'll see a picture of his father, who is Byron Edwin Adams, and his mother, Carrie Bell Tillotson. Again, old Crete names. Now, Byron was very unusual because he had a college degree as well as being a farmer. And that was really something back in those days. His father, William, came from Massachusetts, one of the Adamses from there. Made money in the gold rush, bought a lot of land and put the rest in the bank. Set up the Adamses for a long time there. Together they had 8 children. If you turn the page, you're going to see the picture up at the top. I'm the third from the left. Les was the oldest. He had 2 brothers and 5 sisters. Les was a college graduate too. He got his CPA, and he was working at the time for Columbia Tool Steel in Chicago Heights. He started as a CPA, he eventually got on the board of directors, and then he was secretary-treasurer of the business. And he worked there for 43 years. He also played semi-pro basketball and semi-pro baseball. And to make extra money, like a lot of the Adams boys did over the years, and the Gaines boys, he dug graves in the Adams cemetery. Now, one day I was at my girlfriend's house on 1st Street, and we were sewing and talking. I had my big sewing satchel with all my crochet needles and everything in it, and I looked out the window, and it was starting to get dark, and I thought, oh my God, my mother will kill me. I have to go all the way from 1st Street to Wood Street, and if I get there and it's dark, she will be horrified, because good, proper Edwardian ladies were never out late at night unchaperoned. So, picked up my stuff, said my goodbyes, and I briskly walked out of the house. I can say briskly because with these skirts and the high heels, I couldn't go very fast. And I took a left down 1st Street, took another left on Lincoln, not knowing that Les had just finished digging a grave in the Adams Cemetery. Now, I'm going around that corner of the cemetery thinking, oh my God, my whole focus was get home before it's dark. and all of a sudden he jumps out of the grave and yells, and I scream bloody murder. I grabbed that satchel and I hit that man as hard as I could. I didn't even know who he was. I was so upset. Well, maybe I didn't hit him. I probably beat him. But that's not a very ladylike term. But anyway, he finally made me see who he was and calmed me down. And I was horrified at my behavior. But later he told me that's when he knew I was the girl for him. I didn't faint. I didn't cry. I had real gumption. So we started dating, and we had chaperones, either relatives or family friends. And if you're really lucky, your chaperones will go ahead of you or take a corner so you could steal a kiss or two. And if you look at the picture down the bottom of the page, in my scrapbook, I have underneath it, Lover's Lane. Need I say more? Now, we were in love, and we really wanted to get married, but his family objected. They thought I was a country girl, and they were more city people. Now, I don't know what Les did. He never told me or what he said, but he came to my house one evening, took me into the parlor, and sat me down on the love seat, and he proposed to me. And of course I said yes. I'm not a fool. I was excited. This is the Clemmy family love seat, over 127 years. Of Clemmys and Adamses, couples have boarded here or proposed here, including my grandchildren. Aww. Oh, it's another 127 years. So, we started to plan the wedding. And now it's the night before the wedding. And I'm really excited because Edwardian girls weren't told anything about the wedding night. So my mother called me in her bedroom, and I was so excited. And I went in, and she patted the mattress, and I sat down next to her, and she smiled at me, and she said, "Oh, Ida, I'm so proud of you." And then she said, "You have a wonderful man." And she smiled, and I'm really getting excited now. And she looks at me, and she says, "Don't worry about tomorrow night. Les knows what he's doing." And then she smiled again. And she said, "Just remember to smile." And I went, "What? What is that?" And while I'm pondering that, she gets up the dresser and she shows me this nightgown she made for me for my wedding night. And she put blue ribbon and embroidery around it because that was Les's favorite color. Well, the next day, after the wedding breakfast, we were married. And we were married in the Crete Congregational Church, which is still there, only it's the antique market now. And if you walk in the front door and you look up to the right side, because both our families attended there, you'll see a stained glass window with Adams written on it, which our family donated. The wedding went beautifully, and then we had a wonderful, oh, I forgot, before the wedding. My mother called me into her bedroom again, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to hear it down. But I didn't. She gave me two things, two books. One was a Bible, and she said, "Ida, these are the only two books you need to solve any problems you have in your life." One was the Bible, and the other one was Mrs. B's Household Compendium. The Bible of Victorian and Edwardian brides. It had everything in it. It had how you could raise children. It had how to cook food. It had how to make medicines. It had how to put your husband on a pedestal and make him happy. There wasn't anything that wasn't in that book. And you can tell, it helped me because I still have them today. Wedding's over. We had a short honeymoon because Les had to get back to work. And then we moved into our own apartment. My dentist, Dr. Hotan, had built this beautiful apartment building in Crete. It was limestone. It had big rooms for those days and beautiful woodwork inside. Oh, I was just so thrilled. It cost Les a whole $30 a month to rent that apartment. Goodness gracious, can you imagine? But it certainly was beautiful. Now, if you want to see my apartment, it's still there, only it's connected on Exchange Street to the Hirsch Funeral Home. So when you drive past, that's not only where I lived as a young woman, but that's where I fulfilled the mantra, the Victorian mantra. Married the man who could support me, was a good Christian wife, excellent housekeeper, and now I was going to provide less with an heir. And that's when I'm going to introduce my son, Ralph Everett Adams. He was delivered by Dr. Blim, who was my husband's best friend's father. 90% of the ladies in Crete at that time had their children in their own homes. And here he is, little Ralphie. And Evelyn's going to take him around so you can see him. He has a beautiful hand-sewn gown with a French bonnet that Les's aunt made for him in 1889. Now, if you look at the picture, first you see my wedding picture. Notice I'm showing off my ring just to make sure everybody knows I got married. On the right side is a family portrait of 4 generations of Adams men. William is sitting in the chair holding Ralphie. To the left is my father-in-law Byron, and to the right is Les. Poor Ralphie was not told that you weren't supposed to smile in portraits back then. Now, what did a young woman do? What kind of organizations did we have in Crete? You'd be surprised to know that we had quite a few. We had, you can see in the pictures on the bottom here, the Thimble Club, the Garden Club, the Ladies' Aid Society, Young Mothers Club, and a brand new club called the Crete Women's Club. Over on the right-hand side was the Literary and Dramatic Society, of which I was a member. And that's a tableau that we were doing. Did those often. And there was various church groups that you could join to. Now, 1912, Woodrow Wilson was president, the Titanic sunk, and it scared everybody in Crete because most of us had come over, some of our families on ships, and some even returned to visit their old homes. So it was quite terrifying to all of us. But I want to kind of get away from the world news and get down to Crete. What I remember about Crete. And the first thing I remember are the sounds. And the sounds, I can remember the clopping of the horses' hooves, the whips, the clanging of the iron wagons, the whistling of the trains, the screeching of the trolleys as they went around the corner. And I can also remember the hissing of the gas lights and the milkman bringing our milk to the house. You could hear the glass bottles as they clicked against each other when we put them on the steps with our cream and our eggs. And I remember the grinder man who would go down the street ringing his bells and he'd say razors, scissors, and knives. I grind them. And my favorite, of course, was the Iceman. He would come with his truck and deliver big blocks of ice that we would put in our ice boxes. And sometimes in the summer, he would scrape the ice blocks and give the shavings to the children. Now, what did we wear back then? The ladies had their hair up. And they were wearing, the fad then was a Psyche knot. And you pulled it back and you made a big knot on here, right on top of your head. We loved hats. This is what they call a tilt hat, which was mine. And the hat, the bigger the better. And you can see over here the size of the hats. You call them nowadays Titanic hats. We wore long skirts, cotton stockings, and our shoes were either high buttoned or laced with pointy toes. Lots of petticoats. And we wore a corset. And we wore an accordion corset, which was much better than the Victorian, because they found after years of women wearing the Victorian corset, their bodies shaped like an S. Not too good. So they modified them for us, so they were much more comfortable. Our blouses usually had leg above sleeves, a la the Gibson girl. And our skirts were down past our ankles. God forbid a man should see our leg. Now, that takes us to the men. Some of them parted their hair in the middle. Beards, they wore mustaches, some curly, some not. The older men liked the old walrus mustache. And sometimes they would wear suits, especially if they worked in town, three-piece suits with hats. And all of them carried a pocket watch and wore a union suit. The girls wore basically what the mothers wore, only their skirts were up higher. And I think that was because we didn't have any pavement there. It was just dirt. Dirt sidewalks and dirt right down the center of town. And I'm sure we mothers didn't want to have to wash all those petticoats and dresses all the time. They also wore pinafores and aprons to protect their clothes, and God forbid a girl should ever be seen in pants. They had stockings too, same kind of shoes, and their fashion statement was a big bow in their hair. Now young boys wore flannel or cotton shirts, and they wore breeches or short pants, stockings, and shoes like their father. And if they were getting dressed up, maybe a jacket, a hat, for sure a handkerchief if they were going anyplace. And every little boy dreamed of the day when he would be able to wear long pants, just like his father and older brothers. Now, we're going to talk next about housework. The one housework I think was the most difficult for us then was washing. 2 big barrels of water. One hot, one rinse water. Whites first, colored second. Now you had to be strong in those days. I mean, first of all, you're picking up maybe 1 to 13 kids, you know. You gotta be strong-armed, and you had to be strong to put up a real taut clothesline. My mother's clothesline was so taut you could spin a penny on it. And you would take the clothes out, and you would rinse them, and you would wring them, and then you'd flap them out, trying to get the wrinkles out, and then you'd put them as tight as you could on your clothesline for them to dry. And of course you bleached them during that time too. Now, clothes are clean, you gotta iron them. Heavy, isn't it? Right, you had to heat that up on the stove, and it's very, very heavy. That's why they use them for door things to keep the door open. The only thing you had to worry about with ironing was you didn't scorch the clothes. And my mother taught me to sprinkle my clothes with cold well water before I ironed them. And later on, I used to put my tablecloths in the icebox before I ironed those too. Now, how did we clean our homes? They did have vacuum cleaners, rare and very expensive. So most of us used either a carpet sweeper or a broom. And you got a stiff broom. My mother always told me, stiff broom, nothing else will do. And you got down on your hands and knees and you washed and scrubbed the wood floors. Now if you really wanted to clean your carpet, you would haul it out to the backyard, hang it over a fence or a bush, and you would beat it, which I really like to do, got all my inhibitions out there. And I overheard my husband Les tell his friend, if you want to live to be long, long life, don't ever surprise Ida when she's beating the carpets. We used kerosene, we had gas lights, and we had outhouses. And nobody wanted to go to the outhouse late at night because in those days it was dark when you went outside. So we had slop jars, and we would use those at night and then clean them the next morning. We would cut pieces of newspaper in squares or tear out a piece of the Sears Roebuck catalog, and we used those for toilet paper. Sounds fun, doesn't it? Now, shopping. Oh, I've got to tell you about shopping. I'm telling you, I was a young bride, and I went to the grocery store, which was my mother-in-law's family's grocery store, and it had much more things in there other than groceries. In fact, I got all my sewing materials there because in those days, you pretty much made all your clothes, or at least most of them. I went to the store, I pointed out my purchases, and a young man was going to bring them to my house later, and I didn't have to use any money because they had what was called a running tab. I never heard of such a thing. It was glorious. And then at the end of the month, my sweet husband paid it. Isn't that a great idea? Ah, I love shopping. That's for sure. Now, medical. We used the local doctors, and Dr. Hotan was my dentist. Also, we had midwives, and we used patent medicines. This is how Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper started, before they took all the good stuff out of it. Anyway, St. James Hospital built its first facility for 50 beds on Thanksgiving Day, 1911. But nobody wanted to go there. We were superstitious about it. We didn't have confidence in it. And we figured, I'm not going there unless I'm seriously ill or I'm about to die. Schools. I graduated from Crete Elementary, 4 rooms. Our calendar, school calendar, aligned with when we planted the crops and when we harvested the crops. We had male teachers and unmarried female teachers. Of course, the men got paid more. And they had to sign a very strict moral conduct contract before they could teach. Travel. Let me tell you, I love to travel. We had trains that went from Chicago to Kankakee. We had trolleys. We had paddle boats and canoes that we could use, along with boats on the river. And we had horse and buggies. And horses. I loved riding my horse. I used to ride my horse to Beecher because my cousins lived there. I'd get on that horse and my hair would fly and the pins would go everywhere. My skirts were up in the back. And I'd get to Beecher, my older cousins would scold me because I looked terrible. Fix your hair, fix your outfit. Which I did. And then I'd ride home in the breeze again, and my mother would get to me before I even got through the kitchen door and scold me for my appearance also. So I never won in that regard. Horses are very temperamental. Sometimes they don't want to move. They don't have a reason, they just don't want to move. And then sometimes they get spooked. I don't know what from. Sometimes it's a noise, sometimes we never knew. And they would take off. Now you had 2 choices. If you were in a carriage, horse and buggy, or if you were in a horse. You jumped out or jumped off, or you held on for dear life. And eventually the horses would calm down, they'd wear themselves out, and then they'd take their own way home to their barn and their food. Interesting. We also had cars, not many. The speed limit was 15 miles an hour. Again, we had no paved streets, so the cars often got stuck in the mud. They couldn't go up real high hills. And that's why the farmers had such a good time saying, get a horse when they could ride past them. Now, let's open to your next picture, I think, here. Next page. And we had trolleys, too, which I told you before. Entertainment. What did we do for entertainment? We had all sorts of things here in Crete. We read to each other. We had musical evenings, we had dances, we went swimming, we went hiking, we went sledding, we went skating. We had various socials at the churches. We had bands, local bands, and bands that came in. We had all sorts of fun. My favorite thing to do was to go to the Adams Hotel. The Adams Hotel was a huge hotel that was built where the tennis courts are now in Crete Park. It was 3 stories high. And one whole level of it was a ballroom. Oh, with gold and mirrors. It was beautiful. And I would get my hair up in a nice dress. And Les and I would go there in the evening and we would dance. Oh, the gaslight flickering and the candles and the music. And we would waltz all around that beautiful ballroom. So romantic. Now, another place I like to go to was shopping. We shopped here, we shopped in some of the other small towns, we took the train and some of the trolley, we shopped in other areas like Chicago Heights. But my favorite place to shop was Chicago. I love to go for lunch and then shop at Marshall Foods. For other entertainment we enjoyed, Riverview. It opened in 1904. Oh, it was a wonderful place. I am telling you, they had hot dogs in buns. Have you ever heard about it? Hot dogs in buns. We always had it in paper. But what a clever idea, because the bun absorbed all the juice. And Cracker Jack in 1912 put prizes in the Cracker Jack box. That was a thrill too. along with cotton candy, Aladdin's Castle, the boat ride, the Museum of Odysseys, where I would go like this when I went through. The Bobs. All sorts of things. They had a baby hospital there. They had picnic groves. They had a place to swim. I was a place everybody wanted to go. We had a great time. And in conclusion, I would like to tell everyone here, thank you very much for being such a good audience. And I'd like to quote from something that I said when I was interviewed by the paper. I've been all over the United States, all over Europe, the UK, and the Far East, but Crete, I always come back to Crete because that's where my heart is. Thank you.
I would just like to say that on the back of this is
Oh,
a
yes.
picture of Ida and Russ Adams and their children.
Oh, I forgot to tell you, Les gave me pearls for our wedding present, so you can see them in the picture.
And this was the velvet green dress, right, which is downstairs in the Historical Society cabinets, the one against the wall, along with another beautiful black dress that Ida's told me that she went to the opera in. It was just beautiful. I got to wear it in a fashion show, and it's great. I hardly fit into it. Ida was very tiny. And we have then some flapper dresses down there now of the 1920s. And 2 months ago we had this dress and another beautiful white dress that the young ladies love to wear as
Tea dresses, the white tea dresses.
Yes, and in a couple of weeks, now Ida said that we can put in some of her dresses from maybe the 30s and 40s.
Exactly.
So we'll get to see that too. So don't forget to, as you leave the library tonight, to look there in the cabinet, observe how beautiful the dresses and some of the things in there. We had to take baby Ralph out of there though, the one cabinet. We'll put him back tonight so we can have a good sleep. And then we'll be changing it again in a couple weeks. So Ida and her granddaughter, who Ida told a lot about, to her granddaughter, Carol Perry. We thank you all for coming. You're a great audience. We're glad that at least one man was here to recognize that women were very important in society too. Thank you so much. Bye. Women's Lib.
I'm sure you like the part about putting men on a pedestal, right?